Okay.
Well, good morning or good afternoon.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be with two of my esteemed colleagues today. Glad to be here with Pastor Mark Bernthal and our Pastor Emeritus Jack Deal. Sometimes emeritus seems like too small of a word.
No, it's plenty big.
But I thought it'd be fun to have a conversation with Pastor Jack today. This Sunday, October the 4th, will be the Feast of St. Francis. And this Sunday came up last year. It was one of my first Sundays at Our Savior. We got to move to town a little early and sit in the back pew and just worship as a family. And this was, I think, the first Sunday that we showed up at Our Savior, and Pastor Jack was preaching on St. Francis. So I thought it would be fun to have some conversation with him around the text for this year.
It was so nice of me on your first Sunday here that I took the Sunday off of St. Francis. And my daughter was getting married, so I had a pretty good excuse.
Happy anniversary, Grace.
Yeah, but also thought what a great opportunity to celebrate just kind of the ongoing nature and the legacy of beautiful shared partnership and ministry and mutual regard, esteem, and respect that that this place has an incredible history with. So I am really just coming in for a second this morning to say, Pastor Nicole, happy anniversary on October 1st, your official start date. And Pastor Jack, God bless you. We're so glad you're never more than a stone's throw away, and usually a hell of a lot closer than that. So what is it, Pastor Jack, about this place that just nurtures those kinds of relationships, and really not only among us as rostered leaders, but oh my goodness, throughout the congregation?
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? And it's all by the grace of God. It really is. And it's an incredible gift that we have when we get to share, and it's a beautiful thing. I've seen how it can't be that way. You know, we've all lived that in certain ways, in certain situations, but I'm every day so grateful for this, and to be able to still be connected with this place. It's a wonderful thing. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And it's really kind of unusual in some ways.
It's kind of like how we feel about our pets. It's just a beautiful thing.
Yep.
So I can't wait to see just a big collection of pictures of pets that people are sending in for the virtual pet blessing this Sunday, including Pastor Nicole's dog, my dogs, other family pets, but also Jack and Karen's squirrel.
Squirrels.
And with that, God bless you in the Bible study. I look forward to viewing it and participating in that way a little later this week. God bless. Bye-bye.
God bless. Thanks, Mark.
Bye, Pastor Mark.
Bye, Pastor Mark. Oh, how fun.
Well, as we already said, it is the feast day of St. Francis coming up, which we often affiliate as with pet blessings. We'll talk about why a little bit later in our conversation today. But when I learned and read and did some research on St. Francis, I felt like the text that we were given didn't kind of capture his spirit enough. So instead, I looked at some of the readings from the Gospel of Matthew that we hadn't read. You know, we've been reading consistently along, but we started to skip some stuff. We don't have enough time to read the entire Gospel over the course of Sundays. We could, it just would be a really long reading. And so I found this just 5 simple verses at the beginning of Matthew 18. Pastor Jack, I don't know, do you happen to have those chapter 18, verse 1 through 5 there in front of you?
Sure. Which translation was I? Got the Message, New King James, New Living, New International.
You surprise us. I've got NRSV here, but why don't you surprise us, whatever you're comfortable with today?
Ooh, let's take a look at the Message. That's always kind of fresh and kind of catches you, wakes you up a little bit. Okay.
All right, let's see what that says.
18, 1 to 5. I'm gonna get on the cheaters here a little bit. At about the same time, the disciples came to Jesus asking, "Who gets the highest rank in God's kingdom?" For an answer, Jesus called over a child, whom he stood in the middle of the room and said, "I'm telling you, once and for all, that unless you return to square one and start over like children, you're not even going to get a look at the kingdom, let alone get in. Whoever becomes simple and elemental again, like this child, will rank high in God's kingdom. What's more, when you receive the childlike on my account, it's the same as receiving me." That's a different way of hearing that, isn't it?
Yeah. One of the main, no, go right ahead. What's that?
No, if you want to read it in yours or part of it in yours, that's all right too. But
sure.
oh, there we are.
I've got that pulled up here.
Good.
And can you see all of it on the screen at the same time?
Yep, got it.
Okay, great.
Got it.
At that time, the disciples, so it says at that time, that's just an indication that this is a continued conversation. In chapter 17, we've got Jesus transfigured on the mount. And then it says, but don't tell anybody. We're going to keep this kind of quiet. And so, so then later, Jesus is curing someone. He's foretelling his death. We talk about the temple tax at the end of 17. And they're concerned that Jesus is not paying tax. And he says, yes, of course he does. And so Jesus goes ahead and pays almost a little extra. This is where he catches a fish and says the fish is going to have the denarius to pay the tax. So, so that continuation in teaching brings us right here. So we've just had this position, this juxtaposed lesson on greatness, as one would think of the empire and the emperor, and giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and all of those sorts of things. And so now the disciples probably getting used to some fame, so then the disciples take it a step further. They've just had this incredible moment recently with the transfiguration. And so then we read here, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a child, whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So one of the big differences there that I noticed in those two translations was the NRSV calls it the highest, the greatest, but the Message says, who's got the highest rank?
Yeah.
We really love to rank things.
Yep.
There's something really human about wanting to know that. I heard a sermon recently where the preacher talked about coaching a little kid's soccer team, and loved coaching them when they were 3 and 4 years old, and nobody kept score, and there was no goalie, and they just had to learn how to move the ball from here to there. And you walked off the field and the kids knew who won, because the kids had been counting score the whole time.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yep.
There's just something about our humanity that really likes to keep score and really likes to know who is the greatest or who has the highest rank. Yep. And we like to say, we think of worth in terms of if someone tells you that they are some really high rank in the military, we're impressed, aren't we?
Absolutely.
And
sure.
And rightfully so. But that doesn't mean that the person with a lower rank or just an unlisted one isn't worthy of love, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of.
I was going to say, when I was looking at this and thinking about it, that whole greatness idea, part of it initially rings real true. We say, oh yeah, greatness equals domination, superiority, and advantage. And that's like, yeah, that's the way it is. That's what it works. Domination, superiority, advantage. That's being truly great. But then if we push a little hard and go a little deeper, and we hear this other kind of greatness that is about, rather than being in competition with others, then instead of caring for someone else, deep down we say, wow, now that's true greatness. And so I think initially that kind of world's idea of greatness is understandable. We get it. We're kind of wired that way. But then if you push a little harder and go a little deeper, say, oh, maybe there's even a greater kind of greatness, which I think this speaks to.
Yeah, as much as we are all impressed when an athlete has some of the highest statistics, and we call them the GOAT, the greatest of all time, be it Tom Brady or LeBron James or Peyton Manning or, whatever kind of a league, whatever an athlete is. We've also seen those things scandalized when we start to think, well, maybe they didn't get there on their own. Maybe there was performance enhancing something or another, which was or was not legal at the time. And ESPN has got a ton. They do a ton of behind the scenes kind of documentaries on people's lives, 30 for 30 or something like that, or 60 on 60. I don't know. My husband pulls them up.
30-30, yeah, the 30 to 30.
Whenever Ian watches them, I always sit down because they're so interesting. And what you start to see is some of that behind the scenes greatness, the off the field greatness, the way that they would volunteer at, behind the scenes in their hometown, stuff like that.
Right. Absolutely. And then you say, now that's true greatness.
Right.
Part. Yeah.
But we would never see it if there wasn't this kind of behind the scenes lifting. And I almost wonder if it's greatness if it's done in front of the camera.
Oh yeah, maybe not. But we need to hear about it, in different ways. That's what I think the kingdom of God is like. The kingdom of heaven is like a true greatness that people can see, and that gives everybody a chance to say, oh, that really is the greatest kind of thing. Yeah. Or when the mega millionaires come up and they do these water projects or something, like Bill Gates, you know, as opposed to some other mega millionaires who just keep their employees at minimum wage while they're buying islands and yachts and planes and everything else. Yeah.
All of that is incredible greatness, but I think that we are more touched and more moved by the Mother Teresas.
Yep.
The ones who never had millions to begin with, but just did a bunch of tiny, faithful things. I think the world is not going to be changed by millionaires, and I think that's not what the kingdom of heaven is like. I think it's like a bunch of regular people doing small things with great love. When the kids go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think it was St. Francis, when we celebrate St. Francis, what he kind of models for us is a connection that a worldly kind of greatness divides and separates and ranks. And what St. Francis models is a being connected, which is the way things were meant to be from the very beginning, where God was alone. God said, I need someone to care for, someone to love. And the creation happened, and we're all put here to be connected with God and with each other. And then the brokenness came in, and now true greatness happens when we can see something bigger than that brokenness and being connected, living in harmony with the world, with God's creatures, with the environment, all of that. I think that's all a part of this ongoing kingdom that is unfolding around us. And
and I think that absolutely, and that's part of why picked this particular passage for us to look at this week because that humility and that greatness that we see from the life of St. Francis, which we'll talk about a little more in a moment. But that's what Jesus is really showing us when he pulls a child into his midst and starts to say that this is the greatest. And it really is related to that connection. You know, our society, the society where you and I live today, Pastor Jack, we do treat children like they're great. It is not uncommon to call a child a prince or a princess, even when they live in my humble house or your humble house. We all love to brag how our child or grandchild is the greatest, smartest, best, cleverest, cutest, handsomest, you know.
Yeah, maybe over the top sometime to a fault.
We get a little over the top, but and this is where I think it's really helpful to pause and go back 2,000 years and to realize that when Jesus was speaking, children were incredibly dependent. They were be hardworking and have chores that my children would probably balk at, and they were loved. However, something like 60% made it to 16. And many of them did not have parent, you know, the mortality rate was just a lot higher, and you didn't live as long. And you had a lot of children because there was no way to prevent it, but you also had a lot of children because 30% were going to die or be stillborn within that first year of life. And so for you to say that, you know, one is like this is greatness. Children represented complete dependency. As you were just talking about our connection with the environment and our connection with the community and our connection with God, children absolutely resemble that for us. That was a perfect metaphor that Jesus was giving us here, because the kids were connected to their families and completely dependent in a way that when we search for greatness, it feels like the antithesis to greatness is dependence.
Yeah, that's right. That's in a worldly way. It really, that's the way it is. Because, and what Jesus is talking about there, I think, in calling us to, is that kind of a total dependence and a trust in a God who has the whole world in his hands, as the song goes. But that's counterintuitive to what we think of as greatness, this total dependence and need for what God has to offer and how to be connected there.
Because we love a story about a self-made man.
Oh my goodness, yeah, absolutely.
That feels like greatness. They found their bootstraps and they pulled up and they did something amazing. And those stories exist, but often there's someone who loved them and supported them and paved the way, or worked 2 jobs, or an after-school program that helped, whatever. It's very rare that we do anything alone outside of our community. And when we lose those eyes to see the importance of others and to try to just be completely independent, then we don't see the kingdom of God, which is made up of all these little great acts. So I'm going to bring the Bible study sheet back up here so that we can look at the story, a little bit of some of the research I did on St. Francis. Well, before I do that, I'll say this. We think of humbleness as a good thing, but we forget that the same root word for humbleness is the same as humiliation. It's funny to me how humiliation is a bad word, but humbleness is a good word.
Oh yeah.
So
that was humiliating. Yeah, that's pretty negative usually. But
is God calling us? Is Jesus calling us to be humiliated here?
I don't know. Maybe being humble comes out of being humiliated, not in a negative, destructive sense, but in a kind of a reality check. Like, hey, this is humiliating. This is humbling. See, isn't that funny? Those are two different things. To be humiliated or to be humbled. In a sense, they're pretty similar in some ways.
Yeah, I think they really are connected. I've
Hmm.
got a teenager in my house, and I've got a car that's paid for. And my teenager would really like me to get a new car. And I don't think there's anything wrong with my car. And I can achieve my financial goals better with this car that's paid for.
There you go.
But it's it's embarrassing, and like, what do you mean it's embarrassing? My car is 5 years old. This is not even an old car.
No.
I had much older cars when I was a child, but there's a sense that what I think I'm trying to be humble, I don't need a newer car, can be humiliating to her in some sense. I don't know. I think it's important for us to remember that they are similar, and like it or not, following Jesus isn't easy, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so we're going to see that here in this story of Saint Francis, born in 1811 into a very wealthy family in Italy. His mother, actually, when he was born, named him Giovanni after Saint John the Baptist. But his father, who was in France at the time on business, because I think he was a silk merchant or a cloth merchant of some kind, he came back and was so upset that she named him Giovanni because he wanted him to be a businessman. So he named him Francesco so that he could love France. Francesco meaning Frenchman, basically. And so that he was like bestowing a desire and a path of wealth and business acumen. Francis had a great personality, was very charming, brought a lot of people around him, and became very good at business in France even.
Well, he was truly great
He was
on that level. He was great. But
he was
that's not why we remember him for that part of
but
it.
that's not, but how many people are great and we don't remember them for that? And so so then Francis had all of this business wealth, but that's not what he wanted. He really wanted nobility. He wanted to be a knight, and he went and fought in a war against somebody. I don't remember. Somebody had invaded somebody, and he went and fought in a war, and all these people were killed. But because he was wealthy, Francis was saved for ransom. And so so then he went to fight, but he didn't get any nobility out of that because he was just a pawn in somebody's game to get money, right? So after coming home from that, then he finally was going to get his chance at real nobility, go off to fight in the Fourth Crusades. But Francis didn't get very far. In the first day's drive, God appears to Francis in a dream and tells him that you got this wrong. This isn't where you'll find nobility, and that he should return home. So the question here is, Francis left the business seeking nobility, but his battle armor never got a scratch. How would Francis be received home after never seeing battle? How do you think that conversation went?
Oh, wow. Yep. Humiliated. His father's humiliated, probably. He felt humiliated, but humbled in the best sense of the word.
Yeah, but the story that I read is that it absolutely was humiliating to the family name. It was humiliating to him, but he wasn't yet ready. Like, he didn't immediately, it wasn't, I saw God in a dream and I threw it all away and I followed him. That wasn't quite yet. That took some time and some slow revealing. We'd always like God to work a lot faster than that, but that took some slow revealing for him. Ultimately, Francis does leave his family and his business. He even left his clothes, and then he goes into the woods to be with our Father which art in heaven. He thought that he had to get away to find that. Ultimately, we see Francis, who had spent years chasing lovely things, lovely clothes, lovely places. But then he discovered that the beauty of God's creation far surpassed anything that humans made. We start to see how Francis is remembered for his work with the animals, because we've got stories of him preaching sermons to birds about how grateful they should be to God for their wonderful clothes. And we get lots of stories of Francis and the animals. Bless you.
Yeah, thank you.
St. Francis did have that magnetic personality. It drew others into the woods with him. So that's where we get the Brotherhood of Franciscans. He was not trying to start a brotherhood. He was not trying to abolish poverty. He just was trying to make it a holy thing. He and these brothers lived in absolute poverty. But then should they find someone else that was worse off than them, they would give everything away. Take off their robe, which was rather threadbare, and give that to the one who was worse off. Obviously, there's lots of great stories about how they were or were not received at first, going into towns in rags and preaching about the love of God. But yet God had given him a personality, or somehow he nurtured a spirit up until that point that really allowed him to be just magnetic, and to draw people to him and draw people to Jesus.
And I have to tell you, I know my brother's brother-in-law, my sister-in-law's brother, is a Franciscan, and wonderful guy. And I've got to know the Franciscans to a certain degree through him, and they're just really it's a wonderful hospitality, gracious, welcoming kind of an order, and really the spirit of St. Francis is there. And I know he just has, lives very modestly, has a limited number of clothes, a couple of shirts. If he gets a new shirt, he always gives one away. So they don't have closets full of clothes like we do. But and that's very much in the spirit of, I hear you. It's very much in the spirit of St. Francis, the Franciscan order yet today. And that's kind of a neat thing to continue.
But to have such an impact like that, but to realize that was a becoming for him, that was not an overnight thing. It was something that he had to practice and had to work at. And part of his humility is really interesting, that St. Francis went, when all of these brothers, he had traveled and comes back, and now there's 5,000 guys. And he's like, well, this is not the plan. And so then, of course, the Pope is freaking out that Francis is trying to undo things. And so part of his humility was seeking, going into situations where you and I might think we would never go. So he went directly to the Pope. He'd heard that there was rumblings, and he went directly to the Pope and said, listen, this is not what I had in mind, and I'm not trying to undo anything. I'm just trying to spread the gospel, and I'm going to need your permission here. I would never show up unannounced at Bishop Eaton's office, our presiding bishop. I wouldn't even show up unannounced to Bishop Suarez that ordained me as a pastor a year ago.
I might. Maybe when you're my age, you might. But not I don't know.
Well, how about this? During the Crusades, one of the things that St. Francis did was go and speak to the Sultan, and specifically, like, let's end this war. And the Sultan says, your God sounds wonderful, right? Like, this was a Muslim Christian thing. Your God sounds wonderful, but if I profess to him, then you and we all lose. And this doesn't end peacefully. This just gets worse. So he went, what would be the equivalent of us going to show up at the White House without credentials, show up at Rome, at the Catholic Church, to show up. Let's go knock on North Korea's door. We're not doing that.
Right. Wow.
But I really think that we get to see in St. Francis, I really think that we get to see this juxtaposition of the greatest of all time in his field, in some level, juxtaposed with with humiliation. I mean, wearing the things he wore, taking on the path that he took, not having food to provide for himself, trusting on God and the kindness of others. um, was a humiliating transposition for him. Just now I'm making up words.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
it all makes sense. It all
but
makes sense. And that's the kind of model I think we need to hear. Our world is so caught up today, it seems, in that whole other kind of power stuff, other kind of greatness. And and to hear this, it's always like, oh yeah, this is the way God intended things to be. This is what we need to remind ourselves. This is what we need to hear again. In fact, that gospel from Matthew, that's actually pointed for Ash Wednesday, when we kind of look at ourselves and say, this kind of worldly greatness is just ashes. Ultimately, it's just ashes and dust. And but there's something bigger and better than that. And the true kind of greatness is in recognizing the ashes and dust and that kind of greatness, and seeing something more that connects, that puts us together, that makes us live in harmony with each other, with God, and with the world and God's little creatures as well.
yeah, thank you for bringing up God's little creatures again, because one of the things that at the end of his life, he lost his eyesight, actually. Spent the last few years of his life blind. And in that time is when we get the hymn that he wrote, that in English we've translated to "All creatures of our God and King." So that's, which is attributed to him. That's our English paraphrase of what he wrote. But because all creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and let us sing, right? Like, wow, right, what we can. And I think it's so important for us to be reminded, not just of the inspiration of him who went before, but of what that means for us too. What small things is God calling us to do today? Maybe it's not great things. Maybe we don't have millions, though by some people's accounts we do.
Absolutely.
And so how is God calling us to live today? Where we're putting others first.
Yeah, and that's when those little things happen all around in small ways, it just lifts the whole world up, God's creation up in some special ways.
Absolutely. I kind of wonder, as we consider these things about what, these parables about the kingdom of heaven, and we think of the kingdom of heaven as like this child who's weak and dependent and connected. And yes, they know at a very young age how to keep score. But I wonder if the kingdom of heaven, instead of worrying about greatness, is almost like, well, here, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first.
There you go. They say, well, I've heard on Lutheran territory up in Minnesota, there's a thing called Minnesota Nice. And they say that one of the worst things to come to a four-way stop all at the same time. Maybe there's a little hint of the kingdom in there somehow. I don't know. I would like that. That makes life a little better.
That is good. So our gospel today ends with Jesus saying, "Whoever welcomes a child in my name welcomes me." What are your final thoughts on that? Or is Jesus only talking about welcoming children?
It's just being welcoming, being a welcoming force for anybody. That's just being open, recognize we're on the same level. We're all in this together, and God, God's grace and mercy is just it's level ground at the foot of the cross. I mean, that's kind of what that means. It's level ground when we go to that point. And anybody of great stature in the world or of no stature in the world, we're all on the same footing. And I think that's what this is about. And there's something freeing about that. There's something just, oh yeah, okay, this is the kind of world God wants for us to live in and to live into, which is always a process.
Some of the most humble leaders I've ever met have had the opportunity to meet people the world describes great because they have amassed great financial wealth, or because they have amassed great stature, or whatever the case may be. But the humble leaders that I know, they're just not that impressed or that fluffered or intimidated by that.
Oh.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, okay.
if you ask me about it, I'll tell you I know them, but I'm not going to brag about it because,
There you go. There you go.
yeah.
So sounds like a good time for our world and for our culture and for everybody to hear this story again and to be reminded about that childlikeness, you know, kind of a dependence, a healthy dependence, not an unhealthy, you know, negative kind of dependence, but just a good, warm.
And there's something that children get about our connection with the animals of the world too, that we seem to lose somehow. We had, you know how we don't lose leaves down here in Florida, but our palm fronds slowly break off.
Yeah, okay.
I had a palm frond that was breaking off, and it was the day that the yard waste was going to come, so I just pulled it so it could get down at the street and get out of there. And when I did that, a bird's nest fell out,
Oh,
which was going to fall out
yeah.
anyway. And
Yeah.
these two, what we then discovered was two baby birds.
Oh,
And I didn't know where mama was, and I didn't know the eyes weren't open. This was at the beginning of the pandemic.
oh,
And there's nowhere to go to take this bird. Oh my gosh, it was bad. And we tried to find a way to get it back up in, but it was a palm tree, so there wasn't really a good spot. She should never have put, I have an oak tree over here and a palm tree over here. And my youngest, we still have a funeral placard and a gravestone, a headstone, so to speak,
Yeah.
for this bird whose name is Lily. She only lived for 2 days in our yard.
Oh my goodness.
But kids have this connection with all of creation, and there's a lot for us to learn from them about that as well.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, any parting thoughts today, sir?
No, thank you for being part of it. I look forward to the animal blessing and pets, and our little squirrels will be there. This is always special. We raised 50 squirrels over the course of our life from Little Island. Most reason we're not raising them, but we're feeding some, and our kids are all going to have their pets in the blessing. So
Awesome.
we thank you for that. They thank you for that.
That's fantastic.
Yep. And hopefully the world, we can all just learn something from this. Be better connected with God's creation and with each other.
Amen to that.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay.